Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a game from round 3 of the Norway Chess Super Tournament 2013 between the US's number 1 Hikaru Nakamura and the world's number 1 Magnus Carlsen. We have Nakamura opening with e4, Carlsen replying e5, and now we have a very atypical opening, knight c3, the Vienna Game, atypical at the top level. Knight c6, bishop c4, the minor pieces are coming out. With d3, white is content with giving up the bishop pair, and that is something Carlsen runs forward with, looking to get that light square bishop, and he will. Knight g to e2, stays off of f3 so that the f-pawn can move. And also, I guess you could reason if he is on f3, bishop g4 moves could maybe be annoying. That could be an annoying pin to get out of. Bishop e7. This is the first moment that the bishop could be captured, but it's not. Bishop e7 is played. White castles. This is the second moment where the bishop could be captured. It's not. d6 is played, and now f4, and only at this moment is the bishop captured. Why now? These are questions. This question in particular is one that I tend to ask myself, the timing of which moves are played. I understand this idea of going after the bishop pair, but why now? You had a couple options previously to capture the bishop, so why weren't you doing it then? If you'd like to, pause the video, see if you can come up with some reasons on your own, and I'll just go ahead and share my own thoughts. I think these are important, critical thinking type of skills. It's maybe one of the reasons why chess is so beneficial to kids in the schools. You're basically exercising your critical thinking skills, answering these why questions. So in short, why now capture the bishop? What are your thoughts? My thoughts are as follows. There is no rush with capturing the bishop. He's not going anywhere. You go to b5, you're getting chased around eventually, and whether it's b3 or c4, he's not going anywhere. You could capture him whenever you want. That's one way to look at it. In some sense, the knight, strangely enough, is kind of pinning the bishop. Normally we see the bishop pinning the knight, but okay, in this case, bishop can't go anywhere. That's one frame of mind. And the other one is to look with regard to the pawn structure. Notice how black now has the option to saddle white with an isolated e4 pawn, something that was available to Carlsen, but it's not a direction he chose to go in. And this is, if you're playing on the black side and you're a more strategic positional player, this is something to look a bit more closely into, because now the knight could take up residence on e5, and I believe it's a very solid position for black. Curiously enough, we enter something which becomes much, much more violent. But in short, know that this is the potential that black has available when the bishop captures the knight at this moment right here, only after f4 has been played. Notice how if it's played one move sooner, instead of d6, if captures now, how is this different? This pawn hasn't committed itself, and because of that, maybe Nakamura can now shift gears and say, I don't want to play f4 and allow you to, let's say, play against my isolated e4 pawn, where you have a light square bishop that can maybe potentially target it. And I, of course, don't have a light square bishop that could be defending it. I'm going to play f3 instead. I'm going to keep things much more solid. I'm going to play bishop b3, queen d2, rook a to d1, and my focus will be on d5, and I will have a much more secure pawn structure. These are some things to think about. The timing of which, in short, the timing of which this move is played has to do with A, the bishop isn't going anywhere anyhow, and B, I could potentially enter into a pawn structure which will saddle white with an isolated e4 pawn. Only at this point, only after f4 is it captured. We have the recapture, and with c6, black is facilitating d5, potential for queen b6 checks, and a third detail, which we will see in the game. White gets out of this diagonal prophylactic move with king to h1. After castles, we have f5, looking to close the position up, a typical idea. Your opponent has the bishop pair. Let's keep the position closed. Let's keep more pawns on the board. The more pawns on the board, the less diagonals for the bishops. Black recognizes this and says, no way. I want to open up the position. I want to create pawn exchanges. So what is b5 doing? It's welcoming pawn exchanges, and it's undermining the white center, the central point d5. After c takes b, we don't have this capture. We have an immediate strike in the center with d5. d5 is now playable. This pawn is no longer around to watch over d5. E takes d, c takes d, and now bishop to g4. If you run into this variation here, c takes, or b takes c, now we have d4. The knight is less centrally located, and this pawn drops. 2-0 majority in the center, and he's clumsy on b5. And this pawn is likely to fall. Not a situation to go into. As it stands in this game, after d5, we still do have a 2-0 majority in the center, but with a much different scenario where if we do have, after bishop g5, if this move is played, notice how this knight could eventually make use of e4. He is not as inconvenienced. He is not kicked to the edge in some sense, to that b5 square in particular. If after d4 is played, we could be capturing the knight. And now, perfect spot for the knight. And he could be supported with the other on g3. So we don't have that. We do have this position, however, with those exchanges. We do have bishop g5, bishop b7, knight g3, looks at that h5 square, and now a question is thrown to the bishop. We have those captures, and now it's the two bishops versus the two knights. Who stands better? And, well, that's a difficult thing to answer, really, because these knights are lacking homes. Typical home for a knight is somewhere in the center, but something a bit more than that. Something that is in the center, and you'd really like to have a pawn supporting one of these four central squares. You'd like to have a pawn supporting a knight in the center, but we have none of that for white just yet. So first, queen e2 vacates the d1 square for the rook, and after the game, Nakamura was pointing out some interesting lines, starting first with queen to g4. And let's say after queen to e7, notice how there is the potential for some interesting tactics against the black king position. If something natural like rook to c8, how exactly to react after knight takes g7? You have to be careful. If you recapture f6 and you're dead, the queen is dead or your king. But surprisingly enough, there might be something like king to h7, and now maybe even though white has won a pawn, look at how clumsy the white pieces become. Black is in a position to pin and then win the knight. If the knight runs away, we could be having rook c4, and what a monster of a piece this is on c4. Functioning on a file, functioning laterally, hitting the queen. Now this rook springs to life. Pressure on g2 by the bishop, kicking the knight, maybe c2 falls. A lot of action by the bishops, and these two clowns are doing absolutely nothing. Staring at a pawn, this knight is sidelined. This one on c3 and a1 are the main ones that kind of just look way out of play. Anyhow, white has to be careful. It's a particular tactic to be aware of. This capture followed up with f6, but maybe things could turn out quite good for black. Anyhow, we don't have queen g4 being played, but some interesting tactics that can maybe be coming up from that position. Queen e2 instead, queen e7. Both rooks focus on d5, knight h5. The bishop is now freed up with e4. If we have this advance, well, the knight, of course, will be posting up on e4. Instead, it is e4. The dark square bishop is taken out. Queen is there to recapture. Knight a4 eyes this a5 square, or excuse me, c5. It also allows for c3. The bishop backs up, so that, knight c5 won't be coming with tempo on the bishop. It tucks itself back on a8. c3. White would love to get this rook into d4. That cannot be allowed. d4 is played immediately, and we have those exchanges. Why can that not be allowed, rook to d4? If you do something like this, notice how we eventually have this sort of stuff going on. Well, not this move right away, because you'd be dropping this pawn, but the idea here of blockading on d4, and if you could envision eventually a knight somehow getting to that square, he's going to be a monster. Watching over b5, support point on c6, watching over f5, he would be tremendous. You can't allow that. Carlsen recognizes that type of strategic idea, how how strong, of course, that would be. d4 is played, cd, rook d. The knight comes back to reposition, and keep in mind one additional idea white might have had is to play to c5 and support it with b4, but it just doesn't seem to be, he seems to be too loose on the c5 square, and there wouldn't be the quick follow-up of b4 at that moment anyhow. There is a rook that is currently controlling that square. Instead, he looks to reposition on c3, adding pressure to e4, and also the other detail, being in a position to now recapture with the knight. And now the knight maybe could be making use of e3, the most convenient blockader of a passed pawn, which is exactly what we have here on the black side. This e4 pawn is passed. The knight would like to be the one to maybe blockade it. He would also be there to watch over f5, which would free up the f1 rook. Rook to d8. It's not knight e3, but rather queen e3. The queen looks to get that pawn. After a6, we don't have a takes, or we don't have that exchange, because after the queen recaptures, there's pressure on the rook, the pawn, and even though white is, for the moment, up a pawn, this queen is just way too active. This knight is very clumsy on the edge of the board, and also black has already invested a move for their king not quite some time ago, but they already have a flight square, and white is still needing to have some flight square. In this type of open position, it's tough to find a moment to expend a move to have a flight square for your king. There's so much action going on. You have to deal with your rook. You have to deal with your pawn right here. It's not a square to allow the black queen to get to on a6. So instead, we have a4. Those exchanges come up, doubled b pawns. This bishop is around to watch over them, stops them at the b7 point. Rook d3 chases the queen away. Counterattacking now is Nakamura, hitting the bishop. Bishop d5. And now knight to c3. Doesn't even end up making use of e3 to put pressure on the bishop, but instead looks to put pressure on both bishop and pawn. And now we have e3 right away. And now this is one interesting alternative and something that could have ended very poorly for Nakamura at this point. After queen to e5, it might have been very tempting to play b6. How after e3, what is black threatening? It seems like e2 with counterattack and the rook. If white keeps pressing with b7, what do you do now as black? You smash through on g2. King takes g2. Rook check. This is a very interesting line, and it does not end well for white. The queen can actually grab the rook in this position, allow white to grab a queen, another queen, with check. King gets out of the way, and after maybe best, queen on a to a8, we would have this computer-like variation. This is just one of many, where eventually what will we have? We will eventually have, actually let's just go with this line. We would eventually have something like this, where eventually black ends up winning. I'll just show again one line. We have the queen interposing, again very computer-like, and now surprisingly enough, with this material deficit, e2 would be a very cool way to end up winning this one. If the queen is now coming back to a1, rook to d6, again very computer-like, but this is going to be winning for black. The options here are, well, if you take the queen, where you have the recapture and this pawn will advance, and the other alternative, well, if knight takes pawn, eventually you kick the king away from defense of the queen. Black is winning in that line as well. But in short, the main thing here is to recognize, as white, at the very least, black has a perpetual check, if not more. And so you don't go down that road. You don't go into that at all. And so we don't end up seeing that, but that was potential queen e5 and then potential sacrifices on g2. One other sideline would have been, after this pawn marches, let's say to b7, if bishop takes and we had king here, the bishop could come back and grab on that b7 square. And after the queen recaptures, rook d2 is quite strong, focusing on h2. Something like this. This knight is now loose. This king is just a sitting duck. Knight here, queen here. There's tricks in every direction, however you slice it. Black king is safe, white king not having a great day. So we don't enter that. Instead, it actually ends up much more calm. Instead of queen to e5, we have e3. The minor pieces come off, and with just the heavy pieces around, there's not a lot of action. In fact, things finish up quite quickly from here. A couple checks thrown in. Clearly, from this point, white is up a pawn, but this pawn will be dropping. The queen has pressure on the rook, and again, this other detail of white not having a flight square. This is an important detail, because after something like check, the rook is able to block, and there is no, let's say, queen check to then pick up the rook because you have back rank issues. Something like this. White's the side who's getting mated. So we don't have that. Instead, it finishes up after the rook blocks, a couple exchanges, and after h3, both players shake hands. So a very interesting game. We got to see a knight versus bishop middle game, something that happened quite early, and then the bishop really showing itself in that later part in the game, tucking itself on a8. An interesting example of a knight versus bishop right to that endgame position. I really enjoyed reviewing this game, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. And I hope, as always, you got something out of this video. Take care. Bye.